live.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry, that was quick. My name is Tiffany Keith. I am the preaching pastor of Cowboy Church, which is out in the parking lot in downtown Colorado Springs on Sunday mornings at 9:45. Although it's supposed to be snowing and freezing this Sunday, so we might adjust it a little bit. So keep an eye out for what we might be doing this Sunday. And
I'm Ken Dinger. I preach at the downtown service, the more traditional service. It's on television and on our Facebook, and occasionally get to preach at the Prairie Campus and Cowboy Church as well, and play guitar occasionally with them. So do a lot of things in worship. Patty.
I'm Patty Walker. I'm the pastor of our satellite campus, which is the Prairie Campus. Meets out in the Banning Lewis Ranch area at 10 a.m. for drive-in worship, and we are an adventurous people, so I'm kind of thinking even if it is snowing this Sunday, we'll be there anyways. So come join us. Let's pray. Oh, Holy One, we pray for anybody who might be listening to this online, and for the three of us here, that we might be open to your Spirit. God, help us to have the wisdom and the love and the compassion and the insight to bring your word to any folks who will be worshiping this Sunday with us, and use this time for good. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. What are you working on this week, Patty?
Well, I'm doing a short series on Hagar, and there's almost two whole chapters about Hagar in the Old Testament, Genesis 16 and I think it's 21, either 20 or 21. And I came across this commentator who said that the story of Hagar, it's not a Christian story, it's a biblical story. When we think about a Christian story, we think about a story that's, it's G-rated, it's safe for the whole family, it's been all cleaned up, characters are good and moral. But the story of Hagar, it's a deeply disturbing story. And, the moral flaws of the biblical characters of Sarah and Abraham, they're just right there in full view for us to see. And so it's very troubling in that way. I remember growing up, I heard lots about Sarah and Abraham, the matriarch and patriarch of our faith, and but not so much about Hagar, really. But again, she has these two whole chapters that are devoted to her. And in the first one, in Genesis 16, so Hagar, in case you're not familiar with her, she is the Egyptian slave girl of Sarah. And when Sarah can't have children for years and years and years and years, she decides to take matters into her own hands and to force it to happen for her to have a child, basically to force Hagar to have a child. So she gives Hagar to her husband to sleep with, and then the child will be hers, will be Sarah's. So anyways, here Hagar is, this slave girl, voiceless, powerless. She becomes pregnant, and then Sarah can't stand it and starts basically, abusing her. So Hagar runs away. She runs into the desert, and she meets God there. And that's the really incredible thing, is that she meets God. She gives God a name. She's the only person in the Old Testament to name God. She names God El Roy, which means God sees. So anyways, just this incredible story. And I don't know that this will make it into the sermon or not, but I went back and I read slave narratives from black women enslaved in America in the 1930s. The Works Project, whatever, did all these interviews and collected all these slave narratives. And so I just read one after another these slave narratives of black women who were in a very similar situation where they were forced to bear children so that they could be sold, and just all these horrible things. And so I think for me, also in light of Black Lives Matter, I'm just, reading this story of Hagar through that lens. And I think what is remarkable to me is that, the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, it's scriptures of the Israelite people. And yet, even within those people, this story was important. Even though Sarah and Abraham, they don't come off well, but they still,
No.
it's still
No.
included in there.
Yeah.
And I think it's even more powerful in that the folks who really, were oppressing her, or the tradition, that still allowed it to be there in this really powerful way.
Yeah.
So, anyways, this week, I started last week with Hagar. I think this week I'm going to focus a little more on Sarah, and specifically focusing on her jealousy and what that made her stoop to in herself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's that do for your community though? So what's the takeaway you're hoping that they take from it? So I love this. I didn't get through all the way through your sermon, but I listened to like a lot. I was driving and got where I was going, so I had to stop it. But I mean, it's just so intriguing that I don't know this story that well.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what, if you're focusing on jealousy in that, what is your hope for the congregation to take away?
For this coming week?
Yeah.
Well, I think just to be able to look at our lives and the way jealousy holds us back from living the abundant life that we're called to, and also how it hurts our relationships in terms of who we're called to be together. So anyways, I don't want to give that away too much.
I mean, I don't know. I'm like thinking through especially in your conversation around Black Lives Matters, is and I know we've kind of talked about this before, that equality means giving up some power, right? So do we ever, in our giving up of power, get jealous of it, like wish we had not given it up, wish that that it could be like it used to be, like and because as we go through this thing that we're going through, it feels so disruptive. But I think that's easy, like we know it's disruptive, but I feel personally often to really understand what we give up in diversity and what becomes new, the power that we give up, that we have to be open to different voices, to different thoughts, to different ways of doing things, and we're not always. I mean, I think we think that we want to do that, and then sometimes when we get in there, I'm totally off the text now.
No, I love to hear how you respond. That's good.
Well, it's hard. I mean, I'm the old white guy in the group, right? I mean, I'm the senior pastor. I mean, I live in a position of privilege, and as much as mentally I understand how power works and how it needs to be shared and how voices need to be listened to seek equality feels like an attack on me, and I have to know that. I mean, I have to understand that I'm the one with the power, and I have. It's not right. I mean, at some point, I need to hear the other voices, and also, the Hagar story is interesting to me. I just try to imagine, nomadic folks living in little tents, in a world where the women were valued by the number of children they bore.
Yes.
And Sarah had been barren her whole life. She was old, 70s, 80s, whatever it is in the biblical narrative.
Yes.
And so in this little tent is this woman who has her husband's child in her. It's hard to be there. I'm not defending Sarah's actions.
Yes.
But I understand how having to be confronted by that every single day had to be a painful thing for Sarah.
Yes.
And Abram comes off horrible. She says to her husband, sleep with the slave girl, and he says, why not? And then she gets pregnant, and he's like, hey, she's your slave, do what you want to. I mean, he has no responsibility in this thing at all, and he comes off horribly as well. So, but the amazing thing to me about the story is what you had said earlier, that she's the outsider, and her descendants are the outsiders. And they're labeled clearly in the text as the outsiders, but but God was still there. I mean,
Yeah.
God still met her in the brokenness and the lowest point of her life.
Yeah.
God saw and God was there. So
Yes.
and so there's, this idea that somehow God's on our side, that God favors us. I mean, these were not our people. Those were those people.
Right.
And that's where God was. That's a pretty
Right.
powerful
And I
thing.
do appreciate you bringing up Sarah. I mean, I don't think she's, this villain, this pure villain in the
Yeah.
story. I mean, I see her definitely as this, victim of patriarchy as well. I mean, if you go and look at that, twice Abraham gives her up. Her body is also not her own.
Absolutely.
When they're in Egypt and
Yeah.
beforehand, right, he goes
Yeah.
there and they say, you're beautiful, Pharaoh will kill me, just go and I'm just
Continue
giving you
message.
to his harem.
Yeah.
So
continue
I mean,
my
so she
sister.
also,
Yeah.
is caught up in this patriarchy as well.
And behind all of that, both with Egypt and with Hagar, they risked the covenant. They gave up the covenant. They did not trust God's promise
Yes.
that Sarah would be
Yes.
his wife and bear the child.
Right.
And yet God was faithful. God
Yes.
picked him up, cleaned him up, set him back on the path. God
Yes.
kept God's unilateral promise and covenant with them, even
Yes.
though they kept trying to mess it up and trying to serve
Right.
them.
Which that's why I'm grateful it's a biblical narrative and not a cleaned up Christian narrative, because that's our story, right?
That's right.
We're always trying to take our lives into our own hands and control it and make it happen, and God's always probably shaking God's hands, but still reaching out and loving us and being like, okay, all right, still working with you.
That's a rich story.
Yeah.
It is. I love it. And I have to say, I suppose other people have done sermon series on Hagar before, but when I was growing up, never heard of her. So I'm
That's
excited
for
to do
me
that.
too, so.
I'm doing a book study through Advent, and it's Eating Under the Light of the Moon or something. But one of the questions that she poses as I read the book is, what would the world look like if it wasn't the patriarchy?
Mm-hmm.
Like before it was kind of this male energy dominated is the kind of conversation she uses. And it's beautiful to think, what if that relational feminine energy, like there's this more beautiful idea of what if it wasn't, women were valued by how many kids they had, but rather by the relationships, the way we lead. We talk about this sometimes. So my office is very a relational office, so is yours. Like you have a table to sit at, and you have like a little tea area, and I do too. I have couches, and whereas you go into Kenson, it's the big, kind of this more hierarchy type setting, and I'm aware of that. But what if both count? What if both are really, really important to the human race and God's dream for us, that both matter, that it's not just giving up, who you are, but leaving space for us. And I don't know, it's interesting to think through the story and the world that they lived in.
Yes.
And how some things are still very much the same.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I've got a very familiar passage that's so familiar that it's easy to kind of hear it and not pay attention to it. But Pharisees try to trick Jesus, try to test Jesus, and they ask him, what's the greatest commandment? And there's 613 of them. So if he picks one of them, they're going to say, well, what about this one? And what about this one? And what about this one? That's 612 opportunities to show Jesus he was wrong, And Jesus doesn't pick one of the laws. He picks the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And there's a part of me, I might mention this, there's a part of me that just wants to read that and stop and say, just think about that a second. When Jesus was asked to summarize it, to get us to the very heart of who we are as a people of faith, he said, love God, love your neighbor, no exceptions. That's what he said. Yeah. And we have done so much to make that so much more complicated, and to build walls and to create divisions by trying to not start there. We're going to start with our doctrines, our denominations, our political beliefs, or whatever it might be. You know, we have this desire to create a foundation, a bedrock that's sort of our orthodoxy, rather than loving God and loving your neighbor. One of the things I was reflecting about in this text, though, is that, and I preached on it, you probably preached on it as well. It's one of those that shows up occasionally in the lectionary. And almost inevitably, and almost every sermon that I've listened to out of sort of our traditions moves very quickly to love God by loving your neighbor. That we love God by loving our neighbor. And I think that's true. But Jesus didn't say that. He said love God and love your neighbor. And I don't know that we can love our neighbors any more than is fueled by our love for God. I think the big hole in my preaching over the years has been to not pause and reflect on what it means to love God before we move very quickly to acts of justice and mercy and kindness, which I think we need to get there. And I was just thinking, and I don't have an answer to this. I was thinking about how in these days, in these pandemic days, some of the things, the places where our connection to God is made clear on a weekly basis, the building, the community, the Sunday school class, the fellowship time, the Bible study in the room, and different things like that. I mean, those places where God is brought to our attention, they're not there anymore. And so how do we make ourselves tend to our relationship with God? Facebook, Zoom, yeah, you know, is that enough? And it struck me in reading this is that it's the Shema. That's what he quotes. You know, this mezuzah by the Jewish doors that includes that in there, so that every time they come in and every time they go out, there's this liturgy, this memory of there is one God. We're called to love that God with our heart, soul, and mind. And I don't know that we've got that. I don't know that we've got that liturgy. Absent our buildings and absent our services. So anyway, I'm playing around with some of those. You know, I don't do mystic well. I have all sorts of mystic folks on staff. You know, deeply spiritual people. I always joke that I'm religious and not spiritual. But there's this piece. There's this piece in this text about what does it mean to love God. Absent the second part of that. What does it mean to love God? So I'm playing with some of that.
I love that.
Yeah.
It sounds very Methodist.
Sure.
And that's one of the things I really love about the Methodist tradition. You know, holding in hand that personal piety and that social piety. And I do.
Exactly.
I think that's beautiful. I mean, just listening to you, I felt deeply moved, and I think. Right. I mean, they are two sides of that coin. You know, that it's out of our personal devotion and love for God that we go out and serve. But if we're just, staying home and praying, which I'm the opposite of you. I'd rather I'd love just to sit and do my centering prayer for 20 minutes a day. But, for me, I need the Shema. I need those commandments to remind me, I got to get to the place and make breakfast at Urban Peak, and I gotta do that. So yeah, I also think as you were talking, I was just thinking about our bishop Karen Olavito and how we had orders retreat this past week on Zoom, and she talked about how she feels like we have failed to really teach people to love themselves. And that, that is such a foundation part for people to love themselves, and then out of that space to be able to love others. It's hard to love others if you don't love yourself. Absolutely. And I think, part of what you're talking about, that personal devotion, cultivating one's, drawing close to God through spiritual disciplines. I think we flood ourselves with God's love in that experience, or God floods us, I should say. And so because of that, then we can love ourselves and love others. So, it all is connected with that. But I loved it when the bishop said, we fail to teach people to love themselves. So beautiful.
I have all sorts of thoughts going in a bunch of different directions, so I'm sorry. One of the sermons I listened to this week pointed out that human beings are religious beings, that we all like worship something. So, and the way he said this is, this preacher, is that when church started declining, it's not that people stopped worshiping something, it's that they changed what they were worshiping. So that's where you get in like this social media, like people kind of worshiping. I mean, can you imagine if we went to God as many times a day as we go to Facebook?
That's a great
I mean,
quote. I like that. That's good.
I mean, or politics, or like so we're just worshiping these other things instead of worshiping God. But then now we're not in the church. We're not in the church building, which I think in some ways is a blessing, because it's making us think, what does it look like to worship God, to remember God every time we walk through a door frame, you know, in and out of our house, to remember and love the Lord your God. You know, what is that? What maybe is that liturgy outside of Sunday morning? The work of the people, that work that we could do still together. And I'm thinking of this in a lot of ways through worshiping in a parking lot / not. What does it look like to go to Zoom now that if it gets too cold outside, or to stay outside? One of the things that I'm thinking about is, what if we both worship inside and have worship outside happening at the same time on a screen? Why would people come to a screen if they can watch it at home on Facebook? You know, what is that connection? Can we bring some of that connection? I feel like we are absolutely trying to define love God.
Yeah. You know, I've seen this, I'm sure you have too, in churches, be a sign in the back of the church that says, enter to worship, depart to serve. I wonder if that's backwards. I wonder if that's backwards now, at least. That our job is to worship. I mean, we're called to come together to worship. But when we leave, when we go out of this place, whatever this place is, that's when we need to pay attention to God. That's when we need to see if God's there and worship in that sense. So maybe our service is our Sunday service, and our worship is our life during the week. Anyway.
That's so cool.
The other image that comes to mind, Patty helped me think of this, was and I've used this. It's old. Everybody's used it a million times. But the whole roots and the branches kind of image, or the fruit in the roots. And churches tend to be one or the other.
Yeah.
They tend to be sort of fruit-bearing activist congregations, or root-growing spiritual congregations. But you got to have both. I mean, it's not good to have deep. It doesn't good at all to have deep roots and no fruit. Yeah. If you try to bear fruit without roots, you're gonna shrivel up and die. So that has to hold together somehow. So. What are you working on this week?
I can't wait to see what you come up with. It feels a little bit along the same lines as kind of this love God sort of area kind of works. So I'm doing a man with a withered hand. This is out of Mark 3. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And the Pharisees watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But the Pharisees were silent. Jesus looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So where I'm at still in this process, and I know this is how my brain works, but I get 5,000 things that I want to preach about, and I spend the rest of the week kind of trying to narrow it down to one. Part of me wants to preach on the Sabbath, on this idea of resting in God, resting in God's presence. Because watching Netflix, like binging a Netflix series for 12 hours is not resting. You don't come out of that and feel like, okay, I'm ready to go, I'm rested. So then what is resting? And I'm thinking about this video that came out at the beginning of COVID when everything started really shutting down. And it was imagining a more beautiful world. Like, what if we stayed home enough that the pollution was less? What if we rested enough that we didn't feel overly busy? What if the animals started coming out because it wasn't overrun by humans all the time? And there's something about that image and that video that's really is imagining this more beautiful world where we're not, driven by this worshiping of busy. What does it mean for the Sabbath to be created for us? And then there's this other side of this text that keeps like pulling at me, calling me, is the withered hand of this man and the withered hearts of the Pharisees. That he is telling them. So this is the second of two stories that's talking about the Sabbath, and he's telling them, like, stop being so rules-based. And kind of as I'm studying through this and listening to sermons, it's really funny. The more conservative end of a lot of these sermons are kind of trying to explain the rules away and kind of get into detail around the rules. Here's what the rules were. Here's why they were. Here's what Jesus was like not. And this is the first time that every sermon I've listened to said something about those progressives and the liberals. And I'm like, it's really odd for me that this is unusual that I would listen to these sermons that really feel like conservative liberal sermons from the conservative side. So that's intriguing to me. But the question that keeps driving me to is, when in my life am I so set on my rules, on my way of doing it, that Jesus himself cannot sit in front of me and change my mind? Because they're like, they are so, in this text, so bound by their rules that Jesus can't open them up, that they would rather kill him or start plotting against him than to even consider that they might be wrong.
That's pretty powerful. When you think about the nature of the text itself, when you think about conservatism in the best sense of the word, is to sort of conserve the traditions and the practices of a particular faith or politics, whatever it might be. The story itself attacks that kind of clinging to tradition. And so I'm supposing if you're a conservative theological person, you have to find your way out of this story because it really does attack your mindset of I'm going to defend all of these rules. And so it's interesting that a lot of your sermons kind of move to an attack on progressives or liberals because they had to feel a little bit self-conscious to read this text because they know, this is my impulse, and they don't want to be judged by that, so they got to sort of turn it outwards. But we all have our orthodoxies. We all have all those orthodoxies that we build our life on, liberal or conservative, and we defend those. We use Scripture to defend them. We use the culture to defend them, and Jesus knocks those down on both sides. He knocks down those orthodoxies that we cling to, I think.
So I have to struggle through this week. What might mine be?
Yeah, exactly,
right?
Exactly. It's easy to point at other people's orthodoxies
and conservative places and holding on to traditions or rules or laws or those things we worship are our religions, and I don't know.
Yeah, I see in your story what it brought up for me. It touched on so many themes that we've talked about here today already. I think for me, as you were telling the story, and I think you said something about how he was grieved by their hardened hearts or something like that. And the place I went to is maybe it was less about their allegiance to all these rules and wanting all these laws to be, followed, and more about their power. And about that they didn't want to make room for Jesus, that they were jealous of Jesus. They were jealous of the way the people were responding to him and his authentic, beautiful, transforming ministry. And so they were so jealous and threatened by it that they wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
Just get rid of them.
Yeah.
So I wonder, right, how much of it was that they really loved all these laws, and how much of it was they didn't want to make room for Jesus?
That's like so interesting. There's a book I read a long time ago that talks about the Pharisees and who they were, and that they really, their life, and I don't know if you've talked about this or not, but really with their religious life, wanted to be as safe as they could be. Like they didn't want to get close to that line that might get them out. So I've always read about the Pharisees through that lens, but that's really interesting to like go, okay, can we read them through this other lens of power and jealousy and not wanting to give that up?
Right.
Because as a preacher, I know that it's easy to get jealous of the preachers that are doing really well.
Right.
I mean, we're a comparative lot, like it or not, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Sure.
so I could
And
see.
somebody is always doing better than you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Always.
Absolutely.
Always.
All those Adam Hamiltons out in the world writing all those books.
Then there's the Korean church with 50,000 people. Yeah, so, yeah. Always somebody doing it.
Always. And
Joel
I can
Osteen.
see, and we do this with Adam Hamilton, pointing at the stuff he does that's not the right way. Right. And I could see us, like I could see me going, oh no, that's wrong. You can't make room in that way.
Well, you know, the phrase obviously that was most powerful, don't lose it in your sermon, is the withered heart and withered hand. And where my mind went on that was that I wonder which is worse. I think most of us would see the man with the withered hand as the crippled one.
Mm.
But he really wasn't the crippled one. Because he was open to Jesus and looking for Jesus and available to Jesus. The crippled ones were the ones with the withered hearts.
Oh, that'll preach.
I think
That'll preach.
That's gonna make me cry.
Right? I mean, you know, and so we value people by a whole set of things that we can observe, but we really can't observe the real place where we're alive or not alive, right? Mm-hmm. That was, whether it was power, whether it was fear, whether it was an honest clinging to what they thought was right, whatever that was, that diminished them. That shriveled up their heart. I think you got something there. You can work with that.
Yeah, interesting. I will have to do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So I know I am jumping in. They're not prepared for this. I'm wondering, because I know some of the people that watch us are preachers, and they're preachers that are facing the same things that we're facing this weekend of, are we worshiping inside? Are we worshiping outside? How do we adjust, or do we? So I'm just wondering if we could take just maybe a couple minutes to talk about what are our thought processes on Tuesday afternoon, because they're watching this Thursday, but on Tuesday afternoon on what we're going to do Sunday on a cold, snowy drive-in worship day.
Well, I get to preach inside, so, you know, I don't have any big decisions to make, but I think the two of you have to decide, and I think that the risk is to lose momentum by just going to a Facebook sort of service. But because, especially with what Patty's doing, she's really building community out there with the fellowship time and Sunday school classes and things like that, over against the risk of being in person and at a time when it's rising. So I don't have an answer. I really think that at minimum you need to keep doing the service and do it on Facebook and create as much connection as you can. Maybe you talked about Zoom as a way to connect some people in a way that's not quite in person, but a little bit more than just watching it on Facebook. I think we're prepared downtown to go inside if the numbers allow us to do that, because we've done weddings and funerals and we have the Wednesday night sort of a thing. So we have a routine in place for a small group of people to come inside. But this isn't going to be the only time we have to make this decision. You know, we're going to face it as we move through November and December. And so I don't know. What are you guys thinking? You got an idea?
I want to be adventurous and just try it, and I may, eat my words later and come to you next week and say, wow, that was ridiculous. But I just, I want to try.
Because, and part of the decision making, I think, for us is, our focus has been in two very different places. Like your main community is totally in person. I mean, you're out there doing events and, like he said, like Sunday school and gathering them out there in a way that's so unbelievably and beautifully connectional. You're building community. Whereas for me, since day one, because I started mid-COVID, has been like, the live audience is just my live audience, right? But I've been really pushing as hard as I can to build it as much on Facebook and online and building that community. And I say every week that, we are one worshiping community online and in person. We're not two. And I'm live, so I can do that in a different way than you can. And I think that's creating different thought processes, which I wasn't expecting 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Around what we're doing. I think it's harder for you to move online because your community is in person.
Yeah.
Well, and we talked about a little bit earlier this morning that at this point, we're just making things up. I mean,
Absolutely.
There's
Oh my gosh.
there's no
Absolutely.
blueprint. There's no manual for this stuff. I pray our people will be patient and give us some space to fail, and we may fail gloriously, but not for lack of trying. So I think we do what we can, the very best we can, and we have to make decisions on the fly and be flexible and adaptable, and hope the people will respond. So.
And we just did tell our tech team. He didn't know before that we might be going inside, but now he knows.
Finding out. Well, let me close with a word of prayer. Thank you guys for today. Loving God, we give you thanks for an opportunity to stand under these scriptures and to listen, to challenge one another, to encourage one another, but above all, to hear your words so that they might become your word through our sermons. Bless us throughout this week and bless our congregations that we might both be prepared for that moment when you speak to us. And for this we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Yay, thank you.
Yay.
Thank you, Brian.